I'd like to welcome all of you to the second Friday night reading of the school year. Novelist and essayist Rand Cooper, who is in the audience tonight, was our featured reader back in October. And tonight we are welcoming the poet and fiction writer David Huddle as our December Friday night reader. Before we go any further, I'd like to ask you to turn off any and all devices that you have with you. Turn them off so that we can all enjoy the program. I'll wait for a moment. This is very difficult for me since I don't have a device. So it's hard for me to remember to do this. I don't have to turn off a device because I don't have one. I'd also like to thank the Ensign Bickford Company and Maureen Goldfarb and her daughter Kirsten Ford, whose generous gifts continue to support the English department's reading programs. Without those gifts from those two sources, we wouldn't be able to have programs like this one tonight. Other events coming up later this year include readings by poet Rachel Mennies on January 20th, nonfiction writer Howard Axelrod on February 24th, novelist Sarah Bronstein on April 28th, and singer-songwriter Dar Williams on May 23rd. All of those readings and performances will take place here in the Gun Room, unless we outgrow it. In addition to these visiting writers, there will be 2 more Friday night concerts. I know what the April concert is, but I don't know what the winter one is, but you can find those out on our website. And of course, we'll have a visit from this year's Westminster poet, Marilyn Nelson, on April 17th and 18th. You can check our school's website for further details about all of these events. Let me remind you also that immediately following tonight's reading, there will be a reception downstairs in the Baxter Art Gallery, a chance for you to meet and speak with tonight's readers. I don't want to spend any more time talking about upcoming events because we have a full program for tonight. As is our tradition in the Friday Nights in Gun series, we will begin with readings by students. Every year, the English department sponsors a This I Believe essay writing contest. Students read model This I Believe essays and then write one of their own. By their very nature, This I Believe essays are didactic and abstract. So the trick is to weave narrative into the essay and then use diction and syntax. That's words and sentences, Matthew. To use diction and syntax to move the piece beyond a simple statement of belief. Our 2 student readers tonight have done just that. I've had the pleasure of teaching both of these students, so I know how hard they have worked to get the words right, to find the structures of language that will allow them to make their points. With clarity, yes, but also with grace. So please welcome first Cooper Bellett, and then second Annie Hicks. And
Thank you, Mr. Service. Hi, Cooper Bellett. I'm a boarder from New York City, and I made my piece on an event that affected many New Yorkers' lives. My piece is called Courage. It was September 11, 2001, and it was a beautiful day. I don't remember it very clearly, but I have been told that the day appeared to be starting out like any other day. People were waking up to go to work, rushing to their jobs in the city, and their energy was strong and bright and hopeful as the perfect blue cloudless day. I had to ask to be told this story, and it was relayed to me as I would understand what happened that day to my city, my family, and everyone else in America. It was told to me so that I would be able to comprehend and understand the true courage, what true courage is. My Uncle Keith had already been a volunteer firefighter for almost 25 years. Uncle Keith had worked his way up to chief of the Cresskill, New Jersey Fire Department, a job he did on his free time when he was home in New Jersey. The rest of the time, however, he was an executive in a corporation that was located just 5 blocks from the World Trade Towers. On September 11, 2001, around 8:40 in the morning, the Twin Towers were struck by suicide teams who had hijacked airplanes from East Coast airports. These planes had all passengers on them. 2 of the 3 planes ended up hitting the Twin Towers, while a 3rd plane was taken back by its American passengers and eventually crashed into a field in Pennsylvania instead of the nation's capital. My uncle was already at work at 8:40 that day, and after the towers were struck, there was panic and chaos in the building and in the immediate area. The NYPD ordered all the workers in the building to shelter in the basement because they did not know if further explosions were set to take place. The electricity and air conditioning soon went out in the basement, and nobody's cell phone worked. People began to panic. Everyone felt and heard the huge rumbles when the buildings collapsed, and their basement was soon filled with the white dust everyone seems to remember from that day. My uncle volunteered himself to NYPD, and they had to make sure that the people from the basement were let out safely. He went with people who became overwhelmed by the situation to the first aid stations to make sure they were treated. The area around the destroyed towers were choked. The areas around the destroyed towers were a choking hell of white dust, but my uncle did not leave or begin the long walk uptown. He stayed. He stayed with an extremely frightened pregnant woman who couldn't walk and got her out of the building. He did not know her, but he didn't leave her. He got her to an ambulance area through the intense dust clouds, screaming people, emergency vehicles, police walking around with automatic weapons, debris, injured people laying on the sidewalks, and the fear that more bombs might go off at any minute. Uncle Keith stayed until everyone from the building had gotten out, and then he began his long walk uptown to meet my father. He arrived in my father's office, caked in white dust, his suit almost unrecognizable and his shoes wet and ruined. He had been through a horrible ordeal, brought on suddenly without any warning, but he had stayed. His health remains fine, but he never discusses that day. My uncle was not one of the professionals who raced to the scene that day. He was an ordinary, working guy who suddenly found himself in a situation and reacted like a hero. We all might think that we are brave and can take on the world, but worst comes to worst, can we actually look death in the eyes? I know that my Uncle Keith did that day, and that's why I believe in courage.
As Mr. Service mentioned, I'm Annie Hicks. I'm a sixth form voter from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm going to read my essay entitled Trapped in Transition. I like to think that I'm native to airports. Being a boarding student at Westminster and living 850 miles from my home has allowed me the opportunity to fly on my own since the age of 15. The absence of nonstop flights from Hartford to Indianapolis has made me a regular in the airports of not only Indianapolis and Hartford, but also Atlanta, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and New York City. If my travel experiences have confirmed one thing, it is that I believe in airports. I believe that in a maximum security, air-conditioned, stranger-filled place, we are enveloped for a moment in the present. I believe that airports bring us together before they spread us apart. I believe in airports. There is something comforting about places that scream transition. I recognize the rarity of knowing exactly where I have been and where I will be going next. While sitting at gate 12 on my way home from Thanksgiving, I'm aware that fall term is over, and I'm aware that I'm awaiting my flight home. For a couple of hours, I'm spoiled with the knowledge of where I am. Airports have always marked such transitions in my life. It amazes me that airports hold, on the same day, thousands of people in various stages of transition. It is hard for me to ignore the resilient, ghostly presence of those who have departed and the loud, atmospheric anticipation of those yet to arrive. For a moment, my physical presence in any airport is made obsolete by the realization of those who have passed through before me, those who have sat in the exact same seat and had the exact same call with their mom, holding their chest with the excitement of reunion. I often find myself wondering where the person next to me is going. I wonder if they are traveling to families or loved ones or emergencies. I'm amazed by how our destinations are entirely different and how we are, despite these differences, recklessly, relentlessly, wonderfully together. I am left dumbfounded by our interconnectedness. When I'm standing in the boarding line, waiting for the family in front of me to collapse the intricacies of their stroller and check their oversized luggage, I'm calmed by the idea that airports prolong my time in transition. Traveling alone usually means making pre-boarding conversation with strangers. Before any flight, I seek out the largest window and watch the airplanes dance from earth to sky. At a particularly unclouded viewing window in the Denver airport last summer, the passenger next to me asked where I was headed. He was going home to Jackson Hole, and I was going to Lander, Wyoming, a place I had never been before. It took one conversation to make two completely unrelated lives lives that would never have crossed, related. Airports have the extraordinary ability to dissolve the barriers that would normally separate our existences. For the duration of our wait in Denver, everyone was in transition together. Everyone held on before remembering their independence and spreading apart. Maybe if our world was a little bit more like an airport, we could all hold on to each other. I believe that airports offer perspective and allow us to live in transition. I believe that airports dismantle the perplexity of human relation and converge our lives. I believe in airports.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Cooper. That's an assignment I think we want to continue because it produces a lot of really interesting personal essays from our students. All right, our featured reader tonight is David Huddle, who is actually making a return visit to Westminster. Mr. Huddle first made the trek from Burlington to Simsbury in 2003 as the third Westminster poet. But he's never really left our campus. English teachers teach his poems every year in the 9th and 10th grade curricula, and his book of poems, Paperboy, finds itself included in upper level elective courses from time to time. This past summer, all of our incoming first-year students read Mr. Huddle's quirky but beautiful novel, The Fog's Chronicle, for their English summer reading book. So why is David Huddle valued so highly by the English department? The answer to that question is actually quite simple. Mr. Huddle's stories and poems are highly accessible for high school audiences. That is, they appeal to young readers on the level of character and plot and theme. But they are also highly literary in their qualities. That is, they appeal to English teachers because of their mastery of literary techniques and forms. It's the best of both worlds, entertaining stories and excellent writing. David Huddle himself is a remarkable man. He's published nearly 20 books over the past 4 decades, split about equally between books of poems and books of fiction. During that time, he has earned a national reputation as a poet and as a fiction writer. Moving into the first ranks of American poets and American fiction writers is a pretty neat trick in itself. But just as impressive is the fact that Mr. Huddle has built a reputation for being an outstanding teacher of literature and of creative writing. Personally, I am in awe of someone who can be as good as David Huddle is at so many different things. He was also a really, really good tennis player, I should say. He's also enormously prolific and creative. The stories and poems he is writing now in his 70s are as exuberant and interesting and thought-provoking and masterful as anything he has written earlier in his life. As a school community, we are so lucky to be able to read Mr. Huddle's works, and even more fortunate to be able to welcome him back to Westminster as our Friday night reader.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you. I'm very honored to be reading with Danny and Cooper. That's pretty cool. They get to start. I thought for what I'm going to do is I have 7 books of poetry. The first one was published in 1979. That's this one called Paperboy. And the one most recently published is Dream Center, this one which was published last year, 2015. And I'm hoping to read a poem, maybe 2, from each of these books, and we'll see if I've grown any. If I haven't, please don't tell me that. But anyway, Paperboy is about the town where I grew up in Idaho, Virginia, where for 2 years I was the paper boy. I delivered the Roanoke Times to about 80 people before school. And I learned a lot about the town, and I made a little bit of money. And I drove my parents nuts when weather was cold and I needed to have a ride. So this, and I had just begun teaching poetry at the University of Vermont, And I found that my students wanted to write in a literary fashion. So they wanted to write like Shakespeare wrote, like Keats wrote, like Emily Dickinson wrote. They didn't write like they wrote, so, or they, like the people that they were. So in writing these poems, I got pretty belligerent about it, and I tried to use the way that people talk where I come from, which is kind of flat and understated, and they'll talk about just terrible tragedies, and then they'll say, well, not that bad, you know, whatever. That's how they are. So I tried to use that language, which was my language. So this poem I'm going to read you is called Holes Commence Falling. The Lead and Zinc Company owned the mineral rights to the whole town anyway, and after drilling holes for 3 or 4 years, they finally found the right place and sunk a mine shaft. We were proud of all that digging, even though nobody from town got hired. They were going to dig right under New River and hook up with the mine at Austinville. Then people's wells started drying up, just like somebody had shut off a faucet. And holes commenced falling. Big chunks of people's yards would drop 5 or 6 feet. Houses would shift and crack. Now and then the company paid a little money in damages. They got a truck to haul water and sell it to the people whose wells had dried up. But most everybody agreed the situation wasn't serious. And this is a paperboy delivering poem. This is called Gregory's House. It was a testimony to something that could make my daddy mad, even talking about it. Even when one side of the house collapsed, they just stopped using those rooms. And when the front porch dropped off, Gregory was upset because he had to do his drinking in the kitchen with the kids whining all around him. And the TV turned up so loud he couldn't half concentrate. And they say when the outhouse folded over one January, Gregory cut a hole in the floor and was happy not to have to make that trip in cold weather. But every Saturday morning they sent out one dirty-fisted child to pay me for the paper. Until that Sunday, I threw a heavy, rolled up one too high and up onto the roof, and it fell right on through. And the next Saturday, Gregory himself came out to the fence and cussed me and said I owed him damages for knocking a hole in his house. There's some exaggeration in that poem. This poem is called Stopping by Home, and it sort of addresses the circumstances of being from Ivanhoe, Virginia, but having a job in Burlington, Vermont. And then I had another job that I did down in North Carolina. So I would drive from Vermont down south to Ivanhoe, Virginia, and spend the night, and then I would go down to Asheville and do some teaching, and then come back. And I was always stopping by home, which was kind of a weird circumstance. So and I don't think anything I'm going to read has anything to do with that, but I'm going to read you from a section called Album. And I had a photograph album in my family, had these black pages, and they had all these black and white photos put in them. Some of you are old enough to know those photograph albums. So I began to notice that poems can look like that, sort of like instead of black, this is white, and the poem itself is black. So these blocks of language are a little bit like photographs, and that's how I mean it. So this is called The School, and it's a description of the school in Ivanhoe. The school. On one side, the high school. On the other, grades 1 through 7. The purple curtained auditorium shrank and grew shabbier each August we came back. Mr. Whitt one year decided Charles Tomlinson, Slick King, Dwayne Burchett, Bobby Peaks, and Big Face Cather could be a basketball team. They practiced on a rocky red dirt court with a basket and some boards on a post. They drove to games always at the other school in Slick's Ford. Uniforms were jeans and t-shirts. Big Face and Bobby played barefoot. They lost by scores like 10 to 93, unaccustomed to such space. Wooden floors, lights, adults calling them names. I'm a serious croquet player, And I used to be a good croquet player. I never was a good tennis player. Michael told you a lie about that. I never was a good tennis player. I was a really pretty good croquet player at one time. But the women in my family, and they were old, and my Aunt Stella was all crippled up. Man, those ladies could play some croquet. It was called croquet. This decorous 19th century entertainment, my newborn grandmother and great aunts come down from front porch rocking chairs to play an afternoon hot enough to smother Methodist ladies who say their prayers at night, but who roquet in quiet fury. Gran gathers her concentration, pauses, then lets her red mallet fly forth, causes her skirt to follow her follow-through, then sweeps it down and follows her red ball. 2 wicked split shots on Iva fires. Aunt Stella, bones skewed by childhood polio, makes wicket after wicket, strikes the post, and in dining room tone says, "Keep your manners, but play for keeps." Next poem comes from a book called The Nature of Journey. And I'm going to read a poem. I think I'm just going to read one poem. It's called Local Metaphysics. Metaphysics is the issue of what is real. And in this little town where I grew up, we had an arsonist who liked burning down buildings. And so he burned down Price's store, which was like, who in the world would burn down Price's store? I mean, it was a store. Anyway, he burnt it down. And Mrs. Price, who worked there for all those years, Mrs. Price was right across the street from where she had to see this kind of ash and ruins of her house. So, and my mother told me this story. I didn't know. My mother is the one who purveyed it to me. So that is part of this. Local metaphysics. Finally, the mother had to pack the kids in the car and take them to see her, Miss O.C. Price, who had tended Price's store 6 days a week for the lifetimes of both generations. Though the mother found it hard after she'd knocked on the door of the house and Miss O.C. was standing there, so tired and still not finished crying, but polite as always to speak. "O.C., I'm sorry to ask this, but the children can't believe you were in the fire. They never saw you anywhere but in the store. Could you just come out to the car and let them see you?" The great burnt corpse that had been Price's store lay just across the street, and it stung her eyes even to glance that way, but she walked down there and talked to them through the car window. 3 little girls. The youngest, a towhead, a runny-nosed pretty one named Christine, sat frozen and wide-eyed until Miss O.C. opened the door and pulled the child into her arms and hugged her close. Finally, Christine cried. Then they thanked Miss O.C. and drove home. This was in Ivanhoe, Virginia, a Blue Ridge mountain town so small there's no store there at all now that Price's has burned. My mother, who lives there, and who heard it from somebody, told me this, but I filled in such detail as I need to live with it, as did my mother, and her reliable source, and as will those children, forgetting it and holding on to it through the years until one day that little one, who smelled to Miss O.C. like a country child in need of a bath, whose cheek left a smear of tears and mucus on her dress, will be telling it to her friend over lunch in some city restaurant. The story will be spilling out with such passion that they will both laugh, and this well-dressed woman with a mountain twang in her voice will find herself saying, "This actually happened to me. I remember it clearly," as in amazement she asks herself, "Why am I making this up?" So the next book is called Grayscale. And they're photographs, of these 2 books, they're photographs that come from glass plate negative photographs that were in a box of photographs that I bought for about $50. And in that sequence of photographs was a picture of my grandfather sitting on a motorcycle with a 1917 license plate on it. And so I bought it because I thought maybe there would be relatives of mine in these pictures. And many of them looked like my relatives, but they weren't mine. I couldn't see it. So anyway, these are photographs, and these are, I think, a traveling photographer went through that part of the country, mountain towns, and took people's pictures. And people would dress up and come out and pose for him. And so these ladies here, you can tell this is a grandmother, and this is her daughter, and this is probably the granddaughter. And there are daisies in the field all around them, and this lady has used daisies for a corsage, and she has daisies in her hand as a I guess just a bouquet. The old lady doesn't have any daisies. This is a photograph of the men, and they too are posing. You can tell that this is the patriarch right here. And he has in his belt right here, a pistol. And this is one of his sons, and he's got a pistol tucked right in his pocket here. And they put this on to pose for the photograph. What can I tell you? So Grace Steele, I'm going to read you one from it. This is my tattoo poem. Still haven't decided on my tattoo, but I now and then keep trying to figure out what it ought to be. So this is called Banyan. Giving up the idea that my tattoo will spring forth from inner necessity. That one morning I'll wake up knowing it must be a python winding down my thigh, a blue rose just beneath my right kneecap, or the Byzantine Christ, his face on my back. I know I've got to choose it, pick it from the 10 billion pictures the universe has so kindly let pass before my eyes or rise up in my imagination. In my age, what difference does it make to anyone but myself what image I have needled into my skin? What book do I want to read? Painting do I want to see? Song do I want to hear? Woman do I want to kiss before I check out of this life? That's the kind of choice it is. One picture to go down into the cold, cold ground with me. I'm beginning to see that it's got to be one of those ancient trees, not a redwood or a sequoia. They grow too tall. But one that extends outward, branches horizontal to the ground like wings, a trunk so thick a whole kindergarten of kids couldn't link hands around it. I want its leaves to grow up my whole chest, its trunk to go down my belly and legs, its roots plummeting through my feet, and birds. I want birds flying across my shoulders, my back and arms, egrets, sparrows, condors, and chickadees, all winging toward rest in the great tree where I've hidden my body. How did I read that? I forgot that I wanted that tattoo. I've got to reconsider that. This is called Glory River. I wonder what I have picked up here to read for you. Okay, I have yes. Well, let's just see. Where are we now? I think I might be able to read you two poems here. Let's just see. This is a tuba poem. And there are not so many tuba poems out there, so here's one of them. I did not play the tuba, by the way. I played the saxophone and the trumpet, but I always admired the tuba. Tuba. The vibrating airstream blown into its mouthpiece contains spit, halitosis, food particles, dust mites, along with a few atoms of oxygen that in 2435 BC circulated among the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt. This stream of air, with assorted hitchhikers, serpentines through the metal tube, navigating the valves that process it into the exact tone of an E-flat 2 octaves below middle C that was and is its orchestral destiny. And now this human-generated, machine-shaped column of atmospheric disturbance migrates toward the larger and larger territory of the horn's great shining bell, out into the light of a summer afternoon in the resort hotel's concert garden. Ah, the note! Finally, the one note is sounded at 3:13 p.m. on July 31, 1958, behind the Martha Washington Inn in Abingdon, Virginia. The spit, the food, the dust mites, and even the pyramid's educated oxygen atoms, it all sweetly disperses into the warm sunlight of bass E-flat worth suffering to hear. The sonic equivalent of the grassy dandelion's lawn and Winslow Homer's turn-of-the-century croquet game. A tone so deep and sonorous, it's God harmonizing with the angels. A slice of sound that lets me suddenly and only for half an instant understand gazebos, giraffes, the Jersey Shore, China far away in darkness, how to unhook a brazier is an act of affection, the necessity of death, and the life everlasting. So this is an entirely different poem, and this has to do with my daughter Bess, whom some of you have read other poems about. And Bess, when she was a student at Middlebury, had something wrong with a kidney of hers, and so she had to have a surgery, and we didn't know what it was going to be. We didn't know how the surgery was going to turn out. So we took her to Boston Children's Hospital, even though she wasn't legally a child anymore, to have it done. And she was in surgery for 10 hours, and when she came out, they had found that there was nothing, it was benign, and she would be okay. But she was in pain, of course, and needed to heal. So my wife and our other daughter made that trip to Boston, and we took turns sitting with her by our bedside. And it was my turn late one night, and I'd been reading to her. And that's what this poem is about. In the Boston Children's Hospital, Bess, whom I thought might die, or when she came out of surgery she looked halfway to death, was on the mend enough to be cranky and demanding. And it was maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, and I'd been reading to her for so many pages while she waked and slept and awaked. And it was mostly dark in the room, just the circle of light by her bed. And I stopped and looked at her and saw she was watching me. And we were quiet until she said very softly, "I'm sorry I've caused you so much trouble." And I got so choked up, I sort of had to croak out what I had to tell her, which was that it had been the great privilege of my life to go through that awful experience with her. And I hadn't known that until I said it. And in me right then were such sorrow and grief, because both her death and mine seemed to hover by her bed and all around us. And it felt so much like pain, I even winced. And so it was some minutes of sitting beside my Bess. I was getting better every second that passed in that quiet room, with the nurses and orderlies passing in the hallways, before I leaned back into the dark edge of her bedside light and came to know the joy, came to know the name of what had so sharply pierced me was joy. I'll take it as a favor if you don't applaud after, because it hurts the feelings of the poems that don't get it. I think I've got two more books maybe. It's a poem about my father. And it's called Model Father. You'll see why it's called Model Father when you get into the poem. Model Father. Now when I say my father, meaning his smell of carbide and cigarettes, his curtain of opened and held up newspaper, the red dents at either side of the bridge of his nose, the parchment skin on the backs of his hands, and his thick thumbs that to me meant he was a grown man and that has in recent years attached itself to my hand. I'm really saying my father is not in my life anymore, except in just this way, when I choose words to assemble him, as when he and I sometimes chose to spend a Saturday afternoon at a newspaper-covered card table, gluing together small pieces of balsa, keeping quiet company, without much regard for whether or not what we made would fly. So earlier today, I read a bear poem, and I confess that for some reason I have a bear voice within me. I don't know why. I'm not a very bear-like person. But I had a student who sent me a photograph of a bear munching on weeds in a meadow. Really good picture. And she didn't send any text with it. She just emailed me this picture. So I had this great picture of a wren I had taken in Cape May, New Jersey, and it had its little beak open and it was singing, singing, singing. So I sent her the photograph of the wren. No text. So then I started thinking, what would these two have to say to each other as they crisscrossed in cyberspace? So this is called Wren and Bear, and it's for Tasha Graff, who was the student who sent me the picture of the bear. Wren and Bear. Wren. This morning I am Caruso, Pavarotti, Mariah Carey, Frank Sinatra, and maybe a touch of Lady Gaga and her cutting-edge beauty, and I am loved by the sunlight, the copper beach, the clouds, the air, piano teachers, and all educated citizens, whereas about you they have nightmares. And when they see you, they don't know whether to curl up on the ground or raise their hands above their heads, scream, or be quiet and shiver themselves to death. Plus, I am up here and you are down there. Bear. My grandfather tells of waiting under a cedar tree with his mouth open a whole afternoon until a little jabbermouth wren like yourself flew into it and perched on the pink carpet of his tongue and sang a foolish little song like yours. And so vain was this warbling idiot, it realized where it had perched only when it noticed the picket fence of my grandfather's yellow teeth. And then my grandfather exhaled lightly, whereupon the bird fell over upside down, asphyxiated and dead. And rather than chew up and swallow such a pitiful pile of feathers, my grandfather spat it out onto the ground and excreted mightily and went to look for grubs, beetles, worms, nuts, and berries. Wren. This afternoon, I am Michael Jackson, Mariah Callas, Dave Brubeck, Duke Ellington, the Irish Tenors, the Morbid Tabernacle Choir, plus a touch of Lady Gaga. And my size song and extreme beauty were decreed by the same creature maker who designed you to be the example of all that is crude, odious, dull, songless, fetid, and brutal under the sun, which has little use for you anyway. Look at my wings, look at my wings, just look. Plus I am lullaby, hymn, sonata, concerto, bluegrass, soft rock. And I must remind you again, because you keep forgetting how I am forever up here, and you will always be down there. Bear. What loves me most are rattlesnakes who sleep with me through the winter night. Through the winter, the night, the dark in its thousand variations, the rocky stream that would freeze you into oblivion if you so much as dipped a wingtip. Also the little fawn at the edge of the meadow that dreams of a fast and sweet death. Coyotes whose songs are dedicated to me. Human babies before they learn fear. Dogs who know they are treacherous, locked up in the houses of humans, and so need something to bark at, to pretend to their masters they once were wild. High, rocky slopes of mountains, Edgar Allan Poe, William Faulkner, Jack London, Tom Waits, Mark Rothko, whose paintings are secretly dedicated to me, cellists, tuba players, rock and roll bass players, Shostakovich, and most kind of berries. Kinds of berries. So I'm going to read some Lady Hicks poems for you. And I appreciated the fact that some of you like Ms. Hicks. Not everybody does, but some of you like her. So I'm going to see if I can read some Ms. Hicks poems. For those of you who don't know about Ms. Hicks, she's an invented person. A woman. An invented woman. This is called Why Ms. Hicks Neither Wastes Nor Minces. Why Ms. Hicks neither wastes nor minces words, for some reason in her childhood, took on a tangibility. They were things you could actually taste like sand from the beach. You could put in your mouth before your mother reamed it out and told you not to do that again. Or books you could get your Uncle Philip to read to you if you asked nicely and chose the Caboose book, his favorite. He read so expressively, toddler. He was so expressively toddler. Ms. Hicks loved him and sat on his lap, touching the pages, though he drank too much and her father said he wasn't a very nice person. Or Legos you could put together in a tower your brothers liked to knock down. Or Pink Baby, who didn't cry if you carried her upside down or by her foot. and who helped you take naps, or Spotty the rocking horse, who sometimes tipped over, or the musical vacuum cleaner you could run with through the whole house and sometimes change into a lawnmower. Words could change a dining room table into a caboose or a cave to hide in, or a jail your brothers could lock you up in if you really liked words. They lived in your brain and belonged to you. You could do secret things with them, and it was okay for somebody else to play with them. You had to share, even though you didn't like sharing, but it could be okay if the other kid understood they were your words and they couldn't take them home with them. They had to give them back. This is called Of the Words. Mr. Hicks got a thing for words. Of the words Ms. Hicks considers. Of the words Ms. Hicks considers harmful to her health. Foremost is probably cute, which makes her grit her teeth, or in some pronunciations makes her actually spit, whether she's indoors or out. But then there's share, which makes her go all pukey in the gut. Wonderful and interesting are on her list as constipation causers. One time after she'd listened to a cooking program on NPR, she couldn't poop for a week. Incredible and amazing amp up her death wish. Lifestyle and patriotic make her short of breath. Fun gives her a headache or makes her sneeze rapidly. Healthy isn't so bad, except it makes her gassy. Special makes her want to headbutt whoever said it, but the one she thinks will eventually kill her is enjoy. Next time some pretty-faced waiter sets a plate of food in front of her and sweetly chirps, "Enjoy," like a tweeted soundbite from the kitchen, Ms. Hicks is going to will herself into having a seizure, falling down, kicking chairs and tables, twitching, drooling, swallowing her tongue, and maybe that will teach them to think twice before commanding a person like herself to enjoy her house salad, somebody who used to enjoy actually conversing with other human beings. And have a long poem, which is more a story, and by long, it'll come to an end, but not before it goes on at some length. Is this my water? That's my water. Whose water is that?
I brought that for you too. That's yours too.
Do I have to drink them both? This is when Ms. Hicks was a little girl. She wasn't quite so cranky when she was a little girl. One time, Ms. Hicks saw somebody die. It wasn't anybody she was close to or knew very well. It was her Aunt Wilma Ransom, an old maid, they said she was, and she'd asked the family to let her come do her dying with her own people. She wasn't particular which ones took her home, just didn't want to have to die with strangers being paid to watch her do it. Ms. Hicks was 13, difficult even for herself to live with, a powder of colossal intensity. Her mother called her hoping some rye addiction would make the child more bearable. It didn't. It was then her brother stopped calling her Hazel. They said she wasn't that sweet little girl anymore. Not that that was ever what she was, but she and Aunt Wilma had got along all right the 3 or 4 times the lady had visited over the years. And so Miss Hicks did not object when her father suggested she take on the death watch, aka the task of tending to Aunt Wilma during the weeks of her attempt at making a graceful exit. Ms. Hicks didn't confess to them that death and Aunt Wilma and Elvis were all she could find in the world to respect in those days, and she worried that Elvis might crumble under too much scrutiny. She thought it worth her while to cozy up to the old lady and to death, mostly just to find out if the 10,000 lies of school and family dinner and church and manners and building character and hygiene and everything in moderation and getting a good night's sleep and President Reagan and zippity doodah, etc. applied to them. She was pretty sure death was rock solid in its integrity, but she worried Aunt Wilma might reveal churchy inclinations. She'd hidden back when she and Hazel had enjoyed iced tea and swinging on the back porch glider together. And Aunt Wilma had invited Hazel to play her trumpet for her several times. And Hazel was just learning and wasn't all that far beyond scales and old MacDonald. But Aunt Wilma smiled, listened with her head cocked, and rocked the glider with her feet while Hazel stood in front of her and performed her recital piece. It would make Miss Hicks cringed now because it must have sounded like Satan was her trumpet teacher. But Aunt Wilma talked to her like she was almost a grown-up and said it was funny about practicing. If you kept at it, you got better whether you wanted to or not. And then the old lady told her about taking piano lessons when she was a girl and how she hated it until the day she didn't mean to, but it turned out she loved 3 or 4 bars of a Russian peasant dance she was trying to learn for her recital. It made me cry, she told Hazel. But it was the sweetest crying, like the music had just announced to me that I could make this beautiful sound. It was in A major, I remember that, anytime I wanted to. And Aunt Wilma trailed off then, but Miss Hicks had it in her mind and kept it there like a bracelet or a locket, hidden in her underwear drawer. And so when Aunt Wilma Ransom arrived at the Hickses' house, driven there by her cousin Stanley in his new maroon Buick, Miss Hicks came out to help her move in. And right away the old lady looked her over and didn't quite manage a smile, but nevertheless the two of them let each other know they remembered the other, those iced tea afternoons on the back porch. And Miss Hicks felt like her heart had shifted in her chest, so she carried one of the suitcases while Stanley and her father carried the old lady into the house between them, even though they said she didn't weigh enough to make it a 2-man job. But that's how they did it anyway. And somehow Aunt Wilma made Miss Hicks understand she was half amused and half humiliated by the spectacle she and the men were making. She asked them very softly, please, not to show her sit-downer as they ever so awkwardly carried her up the porch steps. And Miss Hicks stepped close and told her she'd hold on to her rope and keep anything from showing. And so that's how it was with them in the days to come. Miss Hicks ceased her pouting, even around her brothers, and the family let her be the boss of how things were to go with Aunt Wilma's dying. And so it was as if a new and improved human girl had dropped into Hazel Hicks's body. And as Miss Hicks thinks about it these many years later, she sees it as a time when her life took on an intensity she might never have known, if not for Aunt Wilma, and the dwindling of her spirit, her breath, her ability to move or speak. And yet, Miss Hicks sees it now. They had such a complete understanding of each other that actually speaking aloud would have been a come down from what they could manage by moving their eyes, their lips, their eyebrows. Aunt Wilma became her out-of-the-body instructor, or maybe she was her in-the-body instructor, because so much of what Ms. Hicks had to do was to appease Aunt Wilma's body, from which the old lady felt somewhat bemusedly detached, as if the old thing had been bestowed upon her by a whimsical creator. Once Ms. Hicks was pretty sure Aunt Wilma meant her to understand she'd prefer the turtle's body if they'd asked her at the time they were giving them out. And this was when it was time to change Aunt Wilma's diaper and turn her, and the old lady kind of flapped her hand. At the same time, she pulled in her chin so that for that instant she looked enough like a turtle that Miss Hicks laughed aloud. And Aunt Wilma blinked at her so that Miss Hicks from that moment on stopped being repulsed by the waste Aunt Wilma generated. They'd had some vocabulary trouble until Aunt Wilma let Miss Hicks know it was okay to call it puke and piss and shit. Miss Hicks thought neither one of them much liked those words, but in the back room where Aunt Wilma lived now, and her death lived there too, right beside her in the bed, those chunks of language became truth itself. And mostly they didn't have to say them aloud, though there was less and less of the waste Aunt Wilma couldn't manage more than a spoonful or two of oatmeal with brown sugar and cream and a couple of sips of tea with honey in it. Her face more and more the same expression, eager and serious, but private and earnest, like she was a schoolgirl silently memorizing multiplication tables. Or Miss Hicks once thought she saw her lips move ever so slightly, but maybe she just imagined it. The truth was she sat with Aunt Wilma so many hours and even took to sleeping there on a pallet beside the bed that it felt like they were becoming the same person. Like Aunt Wilma was just dissolving into her, and Miss Hicks was doing the thinking and feeling for both of them. The other family members stayed more and more away from them too. Her mother and father said it saddened them too much to see Aunt Wilma just fading away like she was. They could remember a time when that woman could can 10 bushels of peaches in a day and still put a chicken dinner on the table. And Ms. Hicks's brothers never said why they stayed away, but she knew it was because death scared the wee-wee out of them. And maybe they didn't know it, but Ms. Hicks did, and it made her all the more fiercely attached to Aunt Wilma. And oh, it disturbed her when she'd feel how cool Aunt Wilma's skin would get, like she was practicing being dead. Ms. Hicks was constantly covering up her hands, arms, shoulders, tucking her in again and again, but it wasn't the kind of fear that kept her useless brothers away. And it wasn't that she didn't want her Aunt Wilma to die. Aunt Wilma had all along made her understand death was what she yearned for. One day the old lady just said aloud, out of nowhere, "Not heaven, just death, please." And yes, she could have been just trying out the words, but Ms. Hicks was right there by the bed. And so she knew Aunt Wilma had wanted her to hear what she said. Ms. Hicks liked it, that they had that goal between them. For some reason, it made everything easier. Ms. Hicks expected there'd be some churchy talking when death did finally arrive, and she wasn't about to pick a fight with the pastor or the uncles, aunts, and cousins who were inclined to insert praise Jesus into anything they said, like Pastor Salt, praise Jesus. What Aunt Wilma was saying, just please, death, please, did for Aunt Ms. Hicks was to make her ready to let all that foolishness wash over her like rain off a duck's back, as her father had liked to advise her back when her brothers tried to tease her into crying. But now she was pretty sure they wouldn't do that anymore. She felt wildly strong. This one sunny morning she decided just to lie in the bed beside Aunt Wilma because her breathing had got to be so slow. She needed to be close to her to know just exactly when her auntie's body would change from something alive to something dead. She'd given Aunt Wilma her bath the night before and put lotion on her skin all over and brushed her hair and made it look nice. And when she saw Aunt Wilma's face this morning, she'd known it was just about to happen. The way her eyelids had just released themselves down over her eyes, excusing those eyes from ever wanting or having to look at the world anymore. It made perfect sense to Ms. Hicks, and she knew it wouldn't to anybody else who saw them in that bed together, that that's where she needed to be. It wasn't even anything she had to think about. She didn't pause even a second after the thought came to her, and she told herself she'd never confess to anybody as long as she lived that if she could have had her way, she'd have gone right over with Aunt Wilma. She'd have stayed with her wherever it was she was about to go. Thank you for putting up with that. I think this is over.
Thank you very much.